To understand the strategic calculations behind this dispute, one must first consider the timing. Later this year, in July 2026, the North American trade framework faces a critical review deadline. Under the terms of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the three-member countries must decide whether to renew the agreement for another 16-year period, withdraw entirely, or move into a system of annual reviews that would leave the future of the pact in constant uncertainty. For Washington, the assumption appears to have been straightforward. Canada depends heavily on access to the American market and would therefore be reluctant to escalate a dispute. However, that calculation seems to have overlooked a crucial factor. Canada was prepared to push back, and more importantly, Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, appears entirely willing to walk away from negotiations if the terms are unacceptable. When the United States ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, acknowledged publicly that substantive negotiations were not taking place, he was not exaggerating. Multiple diplomatic sources suggest that Carney did not simply delay negotiations with Washington. He rejected the proposed framework outright. That decision, according to analysts, triggered the $20 billion retaliatory tariffs Canada imposed on American goods. To understand that choice, it is worth examining the reasoning behind it. From Ottawa's perspective, the record of recent trade policy from the White House has been marked by unpredictability, agreements questioned after being signed, tariffs introduced under shifting justifications, and negotiations frequently accompanied by public pressure. Faced with that pattern, Carney appears to have concluded that engaging in the current negotiating process would produce more instability than simply stepping away. Instead, Canada has begun signaling a broader shift in strategy, one that involves strengthening economic relationships beyond the United States. In practical terms, that means deeper cooperation with the European Union, stronger trade engagement with Asian markets, and a deliberate attempt to diversify Canada's economic partnerships. From Canada's standpoint, the objective is simple: reduce reliance on a single trading partner whose policies may change abruptly. What makes this moment particularly delicate, however, is the wider geopolitical context. Recent global developments, particularly rising tensions linked to conflict involving Iran, have disrupted global commodity markets. Oil prices have surged, fertilizer costs have climbed, and supply chains are once again under strain. Under those conditions, Canada's position in global resource markets has become significantly more valuable. The country possesses substantial reserves of oil, natural gas, uranium, lithium, and rare earth elements, materials essential not only for traditional energy production, but also for emerging clean energy technologies. In short, Canada controls resources that the United States increasingly needs. The assumption that Canada would ultimately yield because the American economy is larger may therefore underestimate Canada's strategic leverage. Interestingly, Ambassador Hoekstra acknowledged this dynamic indirectly in his public remarks. He encouraged Canada to prioritize development of its energy and mineral sectors in order to qualify for lower tariff brackets under potential trade arrangements. In essence, Washington is simultaneously urging Canada to expand resource production while threatening tariffs on Canadian goods. Critics argue that such a strategy resembles economic pressure more than cooperative trade diplomacy. The legal dimension of the dispute adds another layer of complexity. Canada's complaint at the World Trade Organization focuses on tariffs imposed by the United States on steel and aluminium, tariffs that Canada argues violate the 1994 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, often referred to as GATT. That agreement forms one of the core pillars of the modern international trading system. If the WTO ultimately rules in Canada's favor, it would represent a formal determination that the United States has breached global trade rules. While President Donald Trump has previously expressed skepticism toward the WTO, even suggesting the United States could withdraw from the organization, such a ruling would still carry substantial diplomatic consequences. For one thing, it would grant other countries legal justification to impose retaliatory tariffs. For another, it would undermine American credibility in ongoing trade negotiations around the world. Trade agreements rely heavily on trust, the expectation that commitments made in negotiations will be honored once the agreement is signed. If trading partners begin to doubt that reliability, they become less willing to enter into new agreements. And that concern becomes even more serious if the European Union formally joins Canada's case. Should that occur, the United States could find itself facing a coordinated legal challenge from two of its most significant economic partners. From a geopolitical perspective, such an alignment would represent a notable shift. For decades, the United States has been the central architect of the Western trading system. Yet in this dispute, Washington risks appearing increasingly isolated. Observers in Beijing have undoubtedly taken note. A fractured Western trade alliance would suit the strategic interests of China perfectly, as it weakens the economic cohesion that has long underpinned Western influence in global markets. Canadian officials appear well aware of this broader context. Prime Minister Carney has spent recent months engaging with European leaders and strengthening ties with Asian economies, positioning Canada as a stable and predictable economic partner. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Canada has alternatives, and as the current dispute continues, those alternatives may become increasingly attractive. Returning to Ambassador Hoekstra's remarks, it is worth emphasizing just how unusual they were. Diplomats are typically cautious in public statements, especially when negotiations are ongoing. Their role is to maintain communication, ease tensions, and quietly search for compromise. For a sitting ambassador to openly acknowledge that negotiations with the host country have stalled is therefore a significant signal. It suggests that the disagreement between Washington and Ottawa has moved well beyond routine diplomatic friction. Hoekstra also argued that Canada could secure lower tariffs by accelerating development of its energy and mineral sectors. Yet critics note that such suggestions resemble a form of economic leverage, effectively linking resource policy decisions in Canada to trade concessions demanded by the United States. In the language of international diplomacy, that approach carries uncomfortable implications. Trade negotiations among allies are typically framed as partnerships built on mutual benefit. When discussions begin to resemble pressure tactics, they can easily be interpreted as attempts at economic coercion. And that, according to many observers, is precisely why Canada has chosen to step back from the negotiating table, at least for the time being. The dispute is no longer simply about tariffs. It has become a question of credibility, leverage, and the future structure of North American economic cooperation. There is, however, another important element to this dispute that deserves careful attention. Officials in Washington have suggested that Canada itself bears responsibility for the lack of progress in negotiations. The argument put forward is that Ottawa has refused to engage constructively, but the evidence suggests something rather different. According to multiple diplomatic sources, Prime Minister Mark Carney did not reject negotiations outright. What he rejected was the framework proposed by the administration of Donald Trump. That distinction is crucial. Refusing to negotiate entirely would represent a breakdown in diplomacy. Refusing to negotiate under terms perceived as one-sided is something else altogether. From Ottawa's perspective, the United States has offered little indication that it is prepared to reconsider the tariffs that triggered the dispute in the first place. Nor has Washington offered any significant concessions. What we are hearing instead is frustration that Canada will not accept the terms currently being presented. And in diplomatic language, that is not negotiation, it is pressure. All of this is unfolding with a deadline rapidly approaching. In July 2026, the review clause within the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement will come into effect. At that moment, the three member countries must determine the future of the agreement that governs the vast majority of trade across the continent. The scale of that trade is difficult to overstate. More than $1 trillion in goods and services move annually between the United States, Canada, and Mexico under the current framework. Millions of jobs depend on those flows. Entire industries, particularly manufacturing sectors such as automotive production, are built around supply chains that cross the border repeatedly during the production process. If that system were to fracture, the consequences would be immediate. Automobile manufacturers in the United States, for example, rely heavily on components produced in Canada. Those components often move back and forth across the border several times before the final vehicle is assembled. Without the tariff-free provisions of the current trade agreement, those movements could become significantly more expensive. Tariffs would be imposed at each stage of the process, driving up production costs and ultimately raising prices for consumers. Agriculture presents a similar picture. Canada is one of the largest markets for American agricultural exports. Farmers across multiple U.S. states depend on Canadian demand for crops and livestock products. If tariffs were introduced on those exports, American farmers could quickly lose access to one of their most reliable markets. Energy cooperation between the two countries would also face disruption. The United States imports large quantities of oil from Canada, while natural gas and electricity routinely move across the border in both directions. That energy integration has long helped stabilize supply and moderate prices. A trade conflict could undermine that balance at precisely the moment when global energy markets are already under strain. Much of that strain stems from the broader geopolitical situation. The conflict involving Iran has placed renewed pressure on energy supplies and commodity markets. Oil prices have risen sharply, fertilizer costs have increased, and global supply chains have once again become unpredictable. In that context, Canada's resource base takes on even greater importance. The country is one of the world's largest producers of oil and natural gas. It also possesses substantial deposits of uranium, lithium, potash fertilizer, and rare earth elements, materials that are essential for agriculture, energy production, and advanced technology manufacturing. These are precisely the resources that the United States relies upon to sustain both its economy and its transition toward new energy systems. For that reason, the idea of a prolonged trade dispute between the two countries is deeply concerning for many analysts. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra appeared to recognize this reality when he urged Canada to expand development of its energy and mineral sectors. From Washington's perspective, securing reliable access to those resources is clearly a priority. Yet there is a contradiction at the heart of that position. If Canada faces ongoing tariff threats from the United States, Canadian companies may hesitate to invest billions of dollars developing resources primarily intended for export to the American market. Instead, they may choose to sell those resources elsewhere. Europe and Asia both represent large and growing markets for energy and minerals. If Canadian firms conclude that those markets offer greater stability, investment patterns could shift accordingly. That possibility highlights the deeper strategic change currently underway in Canadian economic policy. For decades, Canada's prosperity has been closely tied to integration with the American economy. Trade flows, supply chains, and investment relationships have all been built around that partnership. However, recent events suggest Ottawa may now be pursuing a broader diversification strategy. Prime Minister Carney has intensified diplomatic engagement with leaders in the European Union and strengthened economic ties with partners in Asia, including countries such as Japan and South Korea. The goal appears to be clear: reduce Canada's vulnerability to shifts in American trade policy. Should that strategy succeed, it could reshape global trade patterns over the coming decade. Canadian exporters would become less dependent on U.S. markets. At the same time, American companies could lose the preferential access to Canadian resources and consumers that they have enjoyed for generations. Such a transformation would not occur overnight, but the process could begin now if tensions between Washington and Ottawa continue to escalate. There is also an important political dimension to the dispute. Within Canada, standing firm against American pressure appears to be politically advantageous. Public opinion polls indicate that Canadians overwhelmingly disapprove of President Trump's trade policies. In that environment, Prime Minister Carney's refusal to concede ground is widely viewed as a defense of Canadian sovereignty. From a domestic political standpoint, backing down could prove costly. If Carney were to accept terms widely perceived as favoring the United States, critics would likely accuse him of capitulating to American demands. Maintaining a firm stance, therefore, aligns both with Canada's negotiating strategy and with the political expectations of Canadian voters. That dynamic represents a significant challenge for Washington. In many trade disputes, economic pressure eventually produces political pressure within the targeted country, forcing leaders to seek compromise. But in this case, the opposite effect may be occurring. American tariffs may be strengthening political support for resistance within Canada rather than weakening it, and that makes the path toward resolution far more complicated. As the July deadline approaches, the question is no longer whether tensions exist. The question is whether either side is prepared to step back before those tensions begin to reshape the entire economic structure of North America.